In the endless desert under a burning sun, one man decided to stop running from his past and start building a promise. But what happens when a powerful tyrant tries to tear it all down? This isn't just a story about land or even about revenge. It's about a broken man daring to believe in home love and second chances. And trust me, the final choice he makes will leave you breathless. Where are you watching from today? Drop a comment below, I'd love to know. And may your day be blessed with hope as strong as the foundations of this story. The late afternoon sun hung low over Willow Creek, New Mexico, turning the desert horizon into a blazing canvas of copper and crimson. The air shimmered with heat, despite the promise of an approaching evening chill, and the dusty wind carried the faint scent of sagebrush and old wood smoke from scattered chimneys in town. Willow Creek was a place caught between survival and surrender. Boarded storefronts leaned against one another like tired drunks, and the main street was carved by wagon wheels and boot soles that had known more hardship than joy. In a weathered corner of town stood a one-room clinic fashioned from a long abandoned telegraph office. Its paint peeled in strips like sunburned skin, and its single sign, hand-painted with the words "Calloway's Aid," swung lazily on rusty chains. Inside worked Mara Calloway, a 34-year-old nurse whose presence seemed to carry both resilience and exhaustion in equal measure. Mara was of average height but carried herself with a quiet dignity that made her appear taller. Her hair, once a rich chestnut, was now dulled by sun, and grief often tied back loosely to keep it from her tired face. Years under the desert sun had deepened the bronze of her skin, and lines of sorrow framed her hazel eyes that had once brimmed with dreams of a large family but now reflected years of heartache. She moved with the efficient grace of someone who had stitched countless wounds and buried more than one person she had loved, the most painful being her husband, who lay beneath cracked earth behind the whitewashed church on the hill. The fever that had followed his passing left Mara barren, a truth that gnawed at her like a silent illness. That evening, as twilight bled across the sky, she sat by lamplight mending a torn bandage, her hands calloused yet tender. The clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic herbs. She brewed herself a mixture of willow bark and yarrow. The wooden door creaked suddenly, the desert wind sweeping dust inside. There in the doorway stood a man she barely knew but had seen from afar, the stranger everyone in town called Jonah McCrae. Jonah was a towering figure standing at least 6'4", his shoulders broad as the mesas themselves. His skin bore the bronze of open plains, his jawline shaded with stubble, and his dark hair curled untamed beneath a sweat-stained hat. At 40, Jonah's face told a story of dust storms, long cattle drives, and nights under harsh stars. His hands were large, rough, marked by scars from ropes branding irons and perhaps fights he'd never spoken about. Yet his eyes, gray as weathered stone, held a softness that contrasted his imposing frame, like a man who had once known tenderness but hadn't dared touch it in years. Jonah was known for his reclusive nature, breaking wild mustangs far out in the desert, appearing in town only for supplies or to quietly help an old rancher fix a fence. No one knew much about his past, only that tragedy had shaped him into a man more comfortable with animals than people. Tonight his presence filled Mara's doorway like a mountain come to life, yet he removed his hat respectfully, holding it against his chest, as though entering sacred ground. His voice was low, carrying a rasp like a man unused to speaking his heart. "Ma'am," he began, eyes locked on hers with an unsettling sincerity, "I'll build you a home." The words seemed absurd against the desolate backdrop of Willow Creek. Mara froze, bandage in hand, unsure if he was mocking her loneliness or if madness had taken him. But Jonah's posture was steady, his gaze unwavering. He wasn't a man prone to empty talk. His few words felt heavy, forged in honesty. Mara wanted to laugh it off, but her throat tightened instead. Something in his eyes reflected the same longing that haunted her own, an ache for connection, for a life beyond loss. Before she could respond, a soft whimper drifted from outside the clinic. Mara glanced past Jonah's towering frame to see a small figure curled on the church steps across the road. She hurried out the dust, biting at her skirts, and knelt beside the boy. He couldn't have been older than 8. His clothes were torn and soot-stained, his small boots nearly falling apart, and his thin frame trembled despite the lingering heat of the day. In his hands, clutched tightly as though it were life itself, was a small, blackened wooden horse. His face was streaked with dirt and tears, eyes wide and wary like a wild creature expecting another blow. "Hey there, sweetheart," Mara said softly, her voice gentler than it had been in years. What's your name?" The boy hesitated before whispering, "Sammy." "Sammy Holt." Mara recognized the name. His parents had perished weeks ago when their wagon caught fire during a lightning storm in the desert. Folks said the boy had wandered off with nothing but the clothes on his back. "Come on, Sammy," Mara said, reaching out a hand. "You're safe now." The boy's small hand, roughened by dust and fear, slipped into hers. She led him into the clinic, offering water and a crust of bread. Jonah followed silently, leaning against the doorframe. His massive presence should have been intimidating, but Sammy looked at him as if sensing something kind in the quiet giant. Jonah crouched to the boy's level, his rough hands resting on his knees. "That your horse?" he asked softly, nodding at the charred toy. Sammy nodded, clutching it tighter. Jonah gave a small, understanding smile. "Every good horse needs a home," he said, eyes flicking briefly to Mara. "So does every boy." The room fell silent, dust motes dancing in the lamplight. Mara's heart tightened. She had spent years giving everything to others, never allowing herself to hope for more. Yet here stood a man she barely knew, offering a promise that seemed impossible but felt like salvation. As night fell and the desert cooled under a rising moon, Mara laid a blanket for Sammy on the cot beside her own. Jonah tipped his hat and stepped into the dark, his long strides carrying him toward the edge of town. But before he disappeared into the shadows, he turned back. "I meant what I said." He called softly, the words carrying on the dry night air. "Tomorrow I start building." Mara stood in the doorway, the weight of the day pressing on her chest. Yet for the first time in years, her heart dared whisper a dangerous thought. Maybe promises can still come true in Willow Creek. Morning came slowly to Willow Creek, the first rays of sunlight painting the desert in shades of gold and pale rose, creeping over jagged mesas and spilling into the dusty streets. A light breeze carried the scent of sage and dry earth, fluttering the tattered curtains of Mara Calloway's clinic. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of boiled willow bark and last night's lamp oil, a testament to another sleepless vigil. Mara sat at her small wooden table, nursing a cup of bitter coffee. Her auburn hair dulled by sun, and time was loosely braided strands escaping to frame a face lined by hardship, yet still holding quiet beauty. Her hazel eyes stared into the cup, but saw only the night before Jonah McCrae's imposing figure in the doorway, his vow lingering like a ghost, and the small, trembling hand of Sammy Holt clinging to hers. She glanced toward the cot near the window. The boy was still curled beneath a threadbare quilt, his face relaxed in sleep, the faintest trace of innocence, fighting its way past the haunted look he'd worn when he arrived. At 8 years old, Sammy had known more loss than most grown men, parents dead in a freak wagon fire, long nights wandering the desert, surviving on scraps and fear. He had small, sunburned hands and a thin frame that spoke of missed meals, yet beneath the dirt and soot, Mara sensed a resilience waiting to surface like a seed stubbornly sprouting in hard soil. She rose, adjusting the blanket over him, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself a silent prayer that this boy might never know abandonment again. By mid-morning, the town stirred awake under a relentless sun. The wooden storefronts, faded and cracked, gave no hint of prosperity. Most folks scraped by selling cattle, weaving leather goods, or mining for copper in the nearby hills. Mara, basket in hand, walked to the general store to trade for supplies. Along the way, she passed Silas Clive Hartman, a name whispered with dread in every corner of Willow Creek. Silas was a man in his late 40s, slick in demeanor and sharp in ambition. His tailored coat and polished boots stood out in the dust-ridden town, a peacock among sparrows. Beneath his charm lay a ruthless streak well known by those who had signed away their land under his legal advisements. His hair was slicked back, streaked with silver, and his eyes were cold, calculating a predator's gaze that weighed everyone by their usefulness. Today, Silas stood outside the post office, speaking to a gaunt rancher with desperation in his eyes. Now, Clyde Silas drawled, his voice smooth as snake oil. "These tax discrepancies aren't my doing, you understand, but the territories'. Lucky for you, I'm prepared to clear the debt for a fair price." Mara clenched her jaw as she passed. She had seen this scene before, Silas tightening his grip on the valley, 1 acre at a time, his sights set on the fertile mesa, lands rumored to be the future path of the railway spur. Folks like Clyde had no choice but to yield or face foreclosure and ruin. Mara longed to spit at Silas's polished boots, but survival had taught her the value of keeping her head down, until now perhaps. Later, Mara found herself drawn beyond town limits. On the rise of Echo Mesa, A lone figure worked in the dry heat dust rising with every strike of a pickaxe. Jonah McCrae stood stripped to his undershirt, sweat darkening the fabric across his broad back. His powerful arms swung the tool with practiced rhythm, each strike deliberate, purposeful. He had chosen a clearing near a spring-fed creek, a miracle in this parched land where the breeze was stronger, carrying the scent of wild sage and distant pine. Wooden stakes outlined the skeleton of a future home. 2 main rooms, a porch stretching wide enough for sunset watching and space for others yet to come. Jonah paused when he noticed Mara's horse approaching, his gray eyes narrowing against the sun, but softening when he recognized her. "Morning, ma'am," he said simply, voice rough but gentle. There was no swagger, no pretense, only a man who had decided on something and would see it through stone by stone. Mara dismounted, dusting her skirts. "You really meant it," she said, glancing around at the beginnings of walls that didn't yet exist. Jonah wiped his brow with a cloth, his scarred hands steady. "A promise ought to mean something," he replied. "Been too many in this world who break 'em." They stood in silence for a moment, the only sounds the cry of distant hawks and the steady trickle of the creek. Mara watched Jonah drive a stake deeper into the ground, each blow deliberate, as though he were anchoring not just wood but some fragile dream. "Why here?" she asked quietly. Jonah hesitated, leaning on the hammer, his weathered face sun-creased and battle-hardened by life softened. "Because this is high enough to catch every breeze, enough water to keep a garden alive, and because it feels like a place meant to hold laughter someday." Mara's heart tightened, yet fear held her tongue. She had been promised homes before and whispered dreams with her late husband, only to have them buried with him. Hope was a dangerous thing to carry in Willow Creek. Before she could respond, the sound of small boots scuffing over rock made them both turn. Sammy stood at the edge of the clearing, the sun making a halo of his sandy hair. He had followed Mara on foot, the charred wooden horse clutched in one hand, uncertainty in his big brown eyes. Jonah crouched, his towering frame folding gently. "You like to build things, son?" he asked. Sammy hesitated, then nodded, biting his lip. Jonah handed him a small, worn-out hammer, its wooden handle smooth from years of use. "Every good home needs many hands," Jonah said softly. "You can help me mark where the walls go." For the first time since they'd met, a flicker of genuine excitement crossed the boy's face. Mara watched a lump forming in her throat as Jonah patiently showed Sammy how to press stakes into the ground, his large, calloused hands guiding the boy's smaller ones. The sight was so tender it stirred something deep in Mara's chest, a longing she had locked away since her own hopes of motherhood were stolen by illness. As the sun began to dip, turning Echo Mesa into a field of molten light, Mara sat on a flat rock watching man and boy work side by side. Jonah spoke little, but his every gesture carried care, steady hands, patient instructions, small nods of encouragement when Sammy got it right. Mara realized this man wasn't building for revenge or pride, but for belonging for himself, for a child who needed a home, perhaps even for her if she dared let herself believe. As they packed up for the day, Jonah handed Sammy the tiny wooden horse he carried. "Tomorrow we'll carve this one a stable," he said, voice low. The boy's smile, small but real, was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. On the ride back, Mara glanced over her shoulder at the staked outline of the house on the mesa. For the first time in years, the barren land of Willow Creek seemed to promise something other than loss. Perhaps she thought some promises could survive even here if someone was stubborn enough to keep them. The morning sun rose over Willow Creek, gilding the desert sands with a deceptive warmth that promised neither relief nor mercy. A pale wind stirred the tumbleweeds along Main Street, whistling between buildings that bore the weary faces of men and women who had learned long ago that hope was a dangerous luxury. Mara Calloway stood at the window of her clinic, her hazel eyes scanning the horizon where Echo Mesa met the endless sky. It had been a week since Jonah McCrae drove the first stakes into that stubborn earth, a week of quiet progress, measured not only by stone and timber, but by the sound of Sammy's laughter growing stronger with each passing day. Yet beneath that fragile hope, something unsettled twisted in Mara's chest, a premonition carried on the desert wind like dust before a storm. Inside the clinic, Sammy sat cross-legged on the floor, polishing a small wooden stake Jonah had let him keep. The boy's sandy hair stuck out in tufts that no amount of combing could tame, his clothes still ill-fitting, though cleaner than the day Mara found him. His big brown eyes carried both wariness and a dawning trust reserved only for those who proved themselves safe. Mara loved seeing that trust bloom, but the thought of it breaking again made her stomach knot. She bent to ruffle his hair and whispered, "We'll make sure this home lasts, little one." Sammy only nodded, clutching the stake like a talisman. By late morning, Mara stepped out to fetch water from the town's main well. As she approached, a tense crowd had gathered. Silas Clive Hartman stood near the pump, flanked by two hired men dressed too sharply for their work holsters heavy at their hips. Silas was immaculate as ever in a dark vest and a smile slicker than snake oil. His sharp blue eyes scanned the townsfolk not as neighbors but as assets waiting to be claimed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Silas announced, his voice smooth and carrying just enough charm to mask the venom beneath. "I regret to inform you that the territory has declared the rights to this well under dispute." Murmurs rose like hornets. "Until proper ownership is established," he continued, "water will be rationed. But I'm a reasonable man. For a fair price, I can ensure your families don't go thirsty." An older rancher named Elliot Green, wiry and bent from years of sun, stepped forward. His face, leathered like old saddle hide, trembled with outrage. "We've drawn from this well since before you slithered into town." "Hartman," he spat, "ain't no paper law says you can cut us off." Silas's smile never wavered, but his eyes turned icy. "Paper law says a great many things, Mr. Green. Best you remember who has the means to argue them." His hired men adjusted their belts in silent threat, sending the crowd backward like a wave retreating from shore. Mara's heart hammered with anger. She had treated half these people for heat exhaustion when drought baked the land dry, and now Hartman dared to choke them further. She opened her mouth to speak, but Jonah's voice beat her to it. The crowd parted as Jonah McCrae strode forward, dust on his boots, gray eyes set like granite. His presence was a quiet storm. He didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. "You're not taking this well," Jonah said evenly, his broad shoulders squared. Hartman tilted his head, that false smile curling tighter. "Ah, Mr. McCrae, you're quite protective of this town lately, almost as if you plan to stay a while." Jonah ignored the jab. "Folks here work hard for their water. You try to cut it off, you'll have more trouble than you know what to do with." Hartman chuckled softly, the sound like a knife slipping free of its sheath. "I don't make trouble, McCrae. I buy it, sell it, and bury it when it no longer serves me. Don't think I've forgotten Leadville." At the mention of that name, Mara felt Jonah stiffen beside her. A muscle in his jaw ticked, his fists clenching before he forced them still. The crowd looked confused, but Hartman's eyes glittered with cruel amusement. "What's this about?" Mara asked sharply, stepping between them. Jonah glanced at her, something pained and guilty flickering in his usually steady gaze. "Not now," he muttered, his voice rougher than usual. Hartman tipped his hat mockingly and sauntered away, leaving a trail of unease behind him. That night, long after the desert cooled and stars burned fiercely above Echo Mesa, Mara rode out to where Jonah worked by lantern light. His massive frame moved in steady rhythm, setting stones into a foundation, as though sheer will could anchor a future. "Jonah," she called softly, dismounting. He didn't look up immediately, but when he did, the vulnerability in his gray eyes unsettled her. "What happened in Leadville?" she asked, voice trembling despite her efforts to keep it calm. Jonah set down his hammer, wiping sweat from his brow, and leaned heavily against a timber post. His face looked older under the lantern's glow, every line a scar carved by regret. 16 years ago, he began, voice low and ragged. "I partnered with a man named Silas Hartman. Thought I'd struck gold, not silver, not ore, but a friend. We opened a mine together near Leadville, brought in workers, promised them safety and fair wages." Jonah's hands curled into fists, knuckles white. Hartman saw only profit, ignored warnings about a weakened shaft, sent men down anyway. It collapsed, 12 miners crushed. And my sister, his voice broke, eyes glistening with unspilled tears. She was bringing food for the workers. Pregnant with her first child, neither of them made it out. Mara's breath hitched, grief pressing heavy on her chest. Jonah looked at her, then anguish laid bare. Hartman walked away richer, sold his share, blamed me, left debts I couldn't pay and graves I couldn't dig deep enough. He scrubbed a hand over his face. "I've spent years drifting, thinking if I found him again, maybe I could make it right. Maybe take back what he stole from every man and woman he's hurt. Coming here, it wasn't just about a home, Mara. It was about stopping him." Mara stepped back, pain and anger knotting in her heart. She had dared believe Jonah's promise was about building something pure, something untouched by vengeance. Now it felt tainted, a house rising on foundations of rage. So all this, she whispered, voice shaking. The stakes, the timber, the words you said to me. Just a trap to lure him out. Jonah's face twisted in despair. No. At first, maybe, but then... He reached for her, but she pulled away, tears stinging her eyes. I buried my husband with broken promises in the dirt, Jonah. I won't build my life on another. She turned sharply, climbing onto her horse, leaving him standing in lantern light, his hands empty, his half-built dream looming behind him like a skeleton under the desert stars. Far below in Willow Creek, Hartman raised a glass of fine whiskey in the saloon, smiling like a man who had just won a battle no one else knew had started. He had cut off the town's water-sown doubt in the only woman who dared defy him, and reminded Jonah McCrae that ghosts never let go easily. But for the first time in years, Mara's own heart felt heavy, not from loss alone, but from a bitter betrayal of hope that had dared to bloom. The desert dawn came late that day, the sun struggling to burn through a gray veil of dust clouds drifting in from the west. Willow Creek lay hushed beneath the weight of a looming storm. Not rain, for the skies held none, but the kind of storm that brewed between men when power and desperation met. The main street was emptier than usual, as if folks knew trouble was drawing closer and thought it best to stay indoors. Mara Calloway stood on the porch of her clinic, arms folded against the chill breeze. She had not slept. The confession Jonah McCrae gave her 2 nights ago still clung like grit in her lungs. A house built on vengeance wasn't a home, it was a trap, and she feared she and Sammy had stepped right into it. Inside, Sammy was stacking little stones on the clinic table, his small hands careful, his eyes fixed on the task as if the right arrangement could keep the world from collapsing again. He had been quieter since the argument between Mara and Jonah, picking up on tension even when they tried to hide it. Mara brushed his hair gently. "You're safe here," she whispered, though the words felt fragile, brittle against the weight of the truth she wasn't sure of anymore. By mid-morning, the town gathered near the well, again tension thick in the dusty air. Silas Hartman had sent his men to guard the pump rifles slung low, smiles thin as knives. Elliot Green argued loudly about water rights, while mothers clutched their children, afraid yet furious. Silas stood tall in a dark coat and polished boots, every inch the king of this crumbling kingdom. He spoke of legal disputes and territorial claims, his voice oily and practiced. But everyone knew the truth. Hartman wanted the land, and the well was his weapon. Jonah appeared from the north road, leading his horse with slow, deliberate steps. He had not shaved in days, his gray eyes hollow but burning with something fierce and dangerous beneath the exhaustion. The town's gaze turned toward him, whispers rising like wind through dry grass. He did not look at Mara, though he must have felt her watching from the edge of the crowd. Instead, he went straight to Hartman. "Enough games," Jonah said, his voice low yet cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "This water belongs to the people who live here." Hartman's smile widened all false civility. "Ah, McCrae, always the noble fool. Still thinking you can fix the world one well at a time. You couldn't even keep a mine shaft from collapsing." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Jonah's fists clenched, but he didn't swing. Instead, he stepped closer, towering over Hartman's voice, steady as stone. "I've buried enough ghosts because of you. You won't add this town to the list." Hartman's men shifted uneasily, hands brushing their guns, but no shot was fired. Not yet. That afternoon, Jonah rode to Echo Mesa alone. The unfinished house stood skeletal against the horizon, the foundations solid, but the walls half-raised like a dream that refused to die. Jonah tied his horse and stared at what he had built, at the stones he had laid one by one with calloused hands, not just for vengeance but for something softer, something he hadn't dared admit until Mara had walked into his life. Yet now his dream sat hollow because he had started it on lies and anger. With a long sigh, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out an old, weathered iron bell, the kind used on frontier farms to call for help. It had once belonged to his father, who believed no one should face trouble alone if good neighbors were within earshot. Jonah hung it on a post near the clearing. If Hartman's men came for this land, or for the people who dared stand against him, the bell would carry a call for justice miles across the valley. It was the first honest promise Jonah had made in years. Later, as the sun dipped low, Mara rode up with Sammy clinging to her waist. She had not planned to come, but Sammy begged all morning, saying he wanted to help Jonah finish the safe house. When they arrived, Jonah straightened slowly, dust covering his clothes, his face shadowed by guilt and longing. Mara dismounted, her posture rigid. Sammy insisted, she said quietly, not meeting Jonah's eyes. "He thinks this house is his." Jonah's throat tightened. He crouched to Sammy's level voice, soft. That true kid, Sammy nodded, clutching the charred wooden horse Jonah had carved a stable for the day before. "You said we could all live here," Sammy whispered. "Promise still good?" Jonah swallowed hard, emotions raw in his face. "Promise is still good," he said, his voice breaking. "I'll build this house for you. Even if no one else believes in it, I will." Mara watched the exchange, a storm of emotions swirling inside her. She had seen too many broken promises, too many dreams buried under dust and grief, but the way Jonah looked at Sammy, protective, desperate like a man fighting for redemption, made her heart falter. Still pain lingered. "Jonah," she said, voice steady but low, "I need to know this isn't just about Hartman. I won't raise a child in a home built on revenge." Jonah stood, meeting her gaze, raw honesty in his gray eyes. "I started this to face him, yes, but now—" He glanced at Sammy, then back at Mara. "Now I just want to stop running. I want to build something that lasts. Not for me, for you, for him, even if you never forgive me." The desert wind whistled through the unfinished beams, carrying away words that were too heavy to hold. Mara said nothing, torn between hope and fear. She gathered Sammy onto the horse and turned to leave, her voice soft but clear enough for Jonah to hear. "Promises don't just need walls, Jonah. They need truth. Build that first." As they rode away, Jonah watched until they were just silhouettes against the dying light. Then he returned to the foundation, working long into the night, each strike of his hammer a vow, each stone laid a prayer that one day they might believe in him again. In the valley below, Hartman lit cigars with his hired men, already plotting how to force Jonah off Echo Mesa. Trouble was coming, and both men knew it. But Jonah swore silently that when it came this time, he wouldn't run. This time, he would stand. The sky over Willow Creek turned a strange shade of copper that morning, as if the desert had set itself ablaze beneath a rising sun. The wind howled low, lifting red dust into the air, coating every porch rail and window pane with the color of rusted blood. Trouble had a smell in this town, a mix of fear gun oil and the stale whiskey Hartman's men drank before a fight, and today it hung heavy over Main Street. Mara Calloway walked briskly from her clinic to Sarah Lorne's boarding house, clutching her worn leather medical bag. Sarah, a stocky woman with sharp eyes and a heart big enough to hold every stray in the territory, stood on the porch wringing her hands. One of the Morrison boys had taken a nasty fall from a skittish horse, and Mara moved quickly to help. The boy whimpered on the cot as Mara set his broken arm, murmuring soothing words, her hazel eyes soft yet steady. She worked like a soldier, tending battlefield wounds, each movement precise, shaped by a life of endless triage, one more life to save before the next disaster struck. But beneath her focus, unease gnawed. Jonah had not come down from Echo Mesa since the last confrontation with Hartman. Each night, Mara lay awake, wondering if Hartman would strike at him, or worse, at Sammy and her to make his point. By midday, the storm broke. Riders thundered into town, kicking up dust and panic in equal measure. At their head was Tucker Vane Hartman's right-hand enforcer, a lean man with a hawk-like nose, cruel mouth, and eyes dead as desert stone. At 35, Tucker wore a trail-worn duster, revolvers slung low, boots stained with more than dust. He was known for settling Hartman's disputes fast and bloody. Today, his hand rested lightly on his gun as he rode straight to the sheriff's office, where the few townsfolk brave enough to gather watched warily. Hartman followed in a fine black carriage, stepping out with deliberate grace, his polished boots striking the boards like the prelude to a noose tightening. He held a sheaf of papers as dangerous as any rifle. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hartman began, his honeyed voice carrying a sharp sting beneath every word. "It pains me to announce that Jonah McCrae is in illegal possession of land on Echo Mesa. My attorneys have uncovered errors in the territorial deed. As of this morning, he is trespassing. If he does not vacate within 3 days, I am authorized to reclaim the property with force if necessary." Murmurs swept the crowd, fear and anger clashing like thunderheads. Elliot Green spat on the dirt. "You're lying, Hartman. That deed's clean and you know it." Hartman's smile didn't falter. "Paperwork can be challenged, Mr. Green. The law is a patient thing, and I have more patience and more lawyers than McCrae ever will." Tucker shifted in the saddle, letting the gleam of his revolver do the talking. Best he leave before accidents start happening. The crowd shivered as one, the unspoken threat settling like grit in their throats. From the saloon doorway, Mara watched every word. Rage boiled inside her, but fear kept her still. Hartman wasn't bluffing. Men like him never threatened, they promised. She thought of Jonah alone on the mesa, hammering dreams into stubborn earth while a storm built under his feet. That evening, Mara saddled her horse and rode out Sammy, pleading to go with her. She left him with Sarah instead, promising to return before nightfall. The trail to Echo Mesa was eerily quiet, the air heavy, the sky burning orange and purple as the sun bled toward the horizon. She found Jonah at the site, his massive frame outlined against unfinished walls, swinging his hammer in a relentless rhythm. Sweat soaked his shirt, his hands raw and blistered as if sheer labor could keep Hartman's lies at bay. "You know what he's planning," Mara said, voice sharp as she dismounted. Jonah paused only long enough to glance at her, his gray eyes shadowed. "I know he's coming," he said simply. "He'll use paper first, bullets after." He drove another nail with a blow that echoed like a gunshot in the dry air. "Then leave," Mara pleaded, stepping closer, anger and fear twisting her words. "This isn't worth dying for, Jonah. Not this house, not this patch of cursed dirt." Jonah turned slowly, every line of his weathered face carved with determination and weariness. "This isn't about dirt anymore," he said, voice low but unyielding. "Hartman's been bleeding this valley dry for years. I've watched men bow to him, watched families lose everything because no one stood up. I can't keep running from him, Mara. Not again." His eyes softened, and for a moment the raw pain beneath his armor showed. "And this house, it's the only honest thing I've ever tried to build since Leadville. If I walk away now, what good am I to you, to Sammy, to anyone?" Mara wanted to scream that she hadn't asked for a savior, that promises weren't kept by throwing oneself under Hartman's boots. But before she could speak, a distant rumble broke the tense silence. A line of riders approached from the town's direction. Hartman's men, a dozen strong rifles, slung dust trailing like a warning banner. Jonah's jaw clenched. He picked up his father's old iron bell and struck it hard, the clang cutting through the evening air like a desperate heartbeat. The sound rolled across the valley, a call older than law and more urgent than fear neighbors' troubles coming. Minutes later, Elliot Green and 3 other ranchers rode up, guns strapped but hands steady. Their faces were grim, voices low. "We heard the bell," Elliot said. "Figured you'd need friends when the snakes came slithering." Mara looked from Jonah to the men who had chosen to stand beside him despite knowing what it might cost. Something fierce stirred in her chest, a fragile ember of hope wrapped in terror. Hartman's riders stopped short, dust swirling around their horses' hooves. Tucker sat high in his saddle, voice dripping mockery. "Evening, McCrae. Thought I'd deliver the eviction notice in person." Jonah stepped forward, unarmed but solid as stone. "This land's mine," he said, his voice carrying across the wind. "And even if you steal the paper, you won't steal the home I'm building." Tucker's hand twitched near his gun, but Hartman held up a gloved hand, smiling like a wolf. "No need for violence, tonight. But know this, McCrae, come dawn 3 days from now, you'll wish you'd left quietly." He turned his horse, his men following like shadows, leaving only the threat hanging in the hot, dry air. Mara stood close to Jonah as the dust settled the unfinished house, looming like a promise too fragile to last. "You can't win against him," she whispered, tears burning her eyes. Jonah stared toward the horizon where Hartman disappeared, fists clenched at his sides. "Maybe not," he said, voice steady as a vow. "But I can make sure he doesn't win easy. And I won't run anymore." The iron bell swayed gently in the evening breeze, its last echo fading over the valley. For the first time, Mara understood this wasn't just Jonah's fight. It was theirs. It was the town's. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and doubt, she felt a dangerous thing take root, belief that maybe, just maybe, a promise could still survive the storm about to break. The desert air on the third dawn carried no bird song, no breeze, only the weight of something final waiting to break. Willow Creek held its breath as the sun clawed over Echo Mesa, spilling gold light across a valley that felt poised on the edge of war. Every window shutter in town was drawn tight. Mothers kept their children inside. The well lay unguarded for the first time in days. Hartman's men had moved on, gathered for the showdown everyone knew was coming. Jonah McCrae stood on the edge of his unfinished homestead boots, planted in the dust, the old iron bell hanging above him like a silent sentinel. His frame was massive, but weary, sleepless nights carved deep into the lines around his gray eyes. Yet there was no tremor in his hands as he tightened the last nails on the half-built porch. If this was where he would stand, where Hartman would finally try to bury him like he buried 12 miners and Jonah's sister, then the ground beneath his feet would not be soft. Mara rode up slowly, Sammy clinging to her waist, face pale but set with a child's determined bravery. She dismounted, eyes meeting Jonah's. The week of fear and betrayal still lay between them, but something else had replaced anger, understanding. She handed Sammy to Elliot Green, who had come with a small band of townsfolk armed with old rifles, pitchforks, and courage sharper than bullets. "You don't have to face him alone," Mara said quietly. Jonah's throat tightened, words failing him, so he only nodded a silent thank you, heavier than a lifetime of apologies. By late morning, a cloud of dust rose from the trail below. Hartman's riders came first, a dozen men in worn dusters and cruel eyes, rifles glinting in the sun. Then Hartman himself arrived in his black carriage, stepping down with the lazy arrogance of a man convinced the world bent to his will. Tucker Vane rode at his side, hand on his revolver, gaze sweeping over the defenders of Echo Mesa with cold disdain. Hartman's polished boots crunched on dry earth as he stopped a few paces from Jonah. "Last chance, McCrae," he called, his voice silk, wrapped around steel. "Sign the deed, leave this land, and maybe you walk away breathing." Jonah stepped forward, the desert wind tugging at his shirt hammer still hanging from his belt like an old promise. "I buried my sister because of you," he said, voice low but carrying each word a strike of truth on an anvil of grief. "I buried good men because you valued silver more than lives. I ran from you for 16 years, Hartman, but not today, not anymore." He pulled from his pocket a folded letter, its paper worn soft from countless nights in his hands. "This is the sworn statement of a surviving miner from Leadville. He made it to California, sent me this before he died. It says you ordered men into an unstable shaft, ignored warnings, lied about the collapse. I've sent a copy to the territorial marshal. Another's on its way to Denver's press." He tossed the paper at Hartman's boots. "You can kill me, but your name will rot before it's carved on any plaque." For the first time, Hartman's perfect smile cracked. His eyes flickered to Tucker, who shifted uneasily. The murmurs from the gathered townsfolk grew louder. Jonah's allies had spread the truth in whispers, and now Hartman's polished facade began to crumble in public. Desperation flashed in his gaze. "Finish this," he snapped to Tucker. The enforcer's gun flashed from its holster, but before he could fire, a rifle cracked from the rocks, Elliot's shot knocking Tucker's hat clean off, dust flying. Other rifles followed, surrounding Hartman's men in a ring of defiance. The iron bell tolled, its deep clang rolling over the mesa like thunder, calling every farmer, rancher, and storekeeper who had ever been bled by Hartman's greed. Within minutes, riders appeared on every side, swelling Jonah's ragtag force to 36 strong. Even Sarah Lorne came shotgun in hand, jaw set like stone. "This ends today," she called out. Hartman looked around, realizing the balance had shifted. The law he had bought with coin was nowhere here, only the raw, righteous anger of people he had wronged for years. "You can't win," he hissed, voice losing its velvet. "Men like me don't lose." Jonah stepped closer, his presence towering though he carried no gun. "You already lost. We're still standing." His gray eyes burned like storm clouds split with lightning. "You can't buy what we're building here, and you can't tear it down." The standoff stretched taut seconds, dragging like hours. Then one of Hartman's hired men dropped his rifle, muttering, "Ain't worth dying for." Another followed, fear outweighing loyalty, bought with gold. Tucker's hands trembled on his revolvers as he saw the odds shift against them. Hartman backed toward his carriage, venom spilling in his words. "This isn't over," he snarled, but his voice shook as the tide turned. Mara stepped forward, calm but fierce. "It's over here, Hartman. This land belongs to the people who live and bleed on it. Try again, and the next bell you hear will bring more than rifles. It'll bring the marshal and a noose." Humiliated, Hartman mounted his carriage and fled, his men scattering like jackals without a leader. Tucker spat in the dust, hate burning in his eyes, but he rode after Hartman, the echo of defeat clattering from their retreating hooves. Silence settled heavy on Echo Mesa, broken only by the wind and the slow release of breath from dozens of lungs holding it too long. Jonah turned to Mara, voice thick with everything unspoken. "I don't know how to build trust after the lies I told," he said, his weathered face etched with fear deeper than any bullet wound. Mara stepped close, eyes wet but steady. "Then build it the same way you build a house," she whispered. "Stone by stone. Truth first. Always." She glanced at Sammy, who had broken free from Elliot's arms and now stood gripping Jonah's work-worn hand with both of his. "This is home," Sammy said softly, childlike certainty cutting through the dust and ruin. Jonah knelt, gathering the boy into a hug, a broken man daring to believe in second chances. Weeks later, the house on Echo Mesa stood finished under a sky that finally delivered rain, washing the valley clean of dust and old grief. The bell remained on its post, a promise that no neighbor would face darkness alone again. Mara's clinic bustled, no longer just a refuge for the sick, but a place where hope was mended too. Sammy ran barefoot through the new garden, Jonah planted laughter, chasing away ghosts. At night, Mara and Jonah sat on the porch, their hands intertwined, watching the sun sink over a land no longer ruled by fear. It hadn't been silver or revenge that built their home, it was choice courage and a love that had survived firestorm and lies to finally take root in honest earth. This story reminds us of something far greater than land or houses. It is about faith, forgiveness, and the miracle of second chances that only God can place in our lives. Just like Jonah, who turned pain into hope and built a true home on truth and love, we too can let God rebuild our hearts no matter how broken they've been. Every day is another chance to choose kindness, courage, and faith over fear and hate. If this story touched your soul, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment, subscribe to this channel, and may God bless you and your family with a home filled with love and peace. If you believe that God can heal every wound and build new beginnings, write amen in the comments and let faith shine through.